Thank you. It's great to be here with you this morning. I was just thinking as I was sitting there, and I'm a bit nervous. I'm not a exuberant public speaker, but the first time I actually stood here and spoke was, I can't remember what year. It was in the 90s, mid-90s, and Peter Breen was the pastor and I was his admin assistant there, and I had to give a testimony, and it was the most terrifying thing in the whole world. But here I am now sharing with you about World Hope International. And I first of all want to thank you as a church because you have supported World Hope through the years, and recently with the disaster in Papua New Guinea, and I'm grateful for people like yourselves who give so that the ministry of World Hope can reach out to those in need around the world. So World Hope International is the compassionate arm of the Wesleyan Church, and I'll share a bit more about that in my message, but briefly, there are three fundraising, if you like, World Hope. So there's a World Hope Alliance, World Hope Canada, World Hope USA, and World Hope Australia. And then we have program countries where we minister. There's about 15 countries around the world that World Hope works in. And we're going to actually have our very first all-directors meeting in Cambodia next month, which I'm really excited about, to get to meet people from Haiti and Sierra Leone and other countries around the world and share and collaborate and cast vision about the areas where we work globally. But here I'm here to share with you a message from the gospel, but from the word, but also to tell you a bit about what World Hope does and how we reach out the hand of Jesus to the least of these around the world. When I was growing up, I loved to help my dad in the workshop. I'd hold the end of the plank of wood while he cut the other end with a manual saw. He'd then get the planer and he'd smooth the edges to make sure that they were even. I loved those curly pieces that fell to the ground and the smell of the fresh wood. Dad always wanted to be a carpenter, but as the eldest son, he took over the family farm. And then God called him to Bible college, and then eventually the mission field, where he actually got to do lots of carpentry, building houses, building health centres, building schools, and building churches. One year when my brother Phil was home from school, I forgot to say, we were in Papua New Guinea, so we were missionaries in Papua New Guinea. And one year when my brother Phil was home for school holidays, he was in high school back here in Australia, and back then the government would fly the kids back over to PNG once a year. So he'd come home once a year. And during those holidays, Dad was building a school building, and Phil's job was to put up the external walls. And because they were planks of wood, he needed help, so my job was to hold the other end while he hammered them in. When we'd finished the whole wall, Dad came to inspect our job and told us that we'd used the wrong size nails and we had to do the whole thing again. I don't think we pulled it all off, we just hammered in the right size nails. We then had to put down the floorboards. So Phil would hammer the nail in, and then I'd come along behind him and use the hole punch I can't remember that's what it's called, but anyway, I think that's the right word. The nail punch, that's it, nail punch. And hammer it in, and then we'd go along and we'd fill the hole with putty to cover the holes so that it was smooth and people weren't going to hurt their feet on the nail. My son Brendan and his wife Julie enjoy flipping houses. They buy a rundown house, they renovate it, and they sell it for profit. And they've done a few of these. And I absolutely love the end project. I would not, however, love doing the renovating. In fact, on one of those houses, as we walked out of the car, the secret's coming out now, Brendan, we walked out of the car and I said to Dallas, my husband, don't you even think about buying one of these because I will not help you do it. Today I want us to look at the story of the biggest renovation project in the Bible, the renovation of the wall around Jerusalem. But before we do that, let's just lay a bit of background history. There was a guy called Ezekiel, and he was the son of an Israelite priest called Buzi. And for the first 25 years of Ezekiel's life, he spent training for the priesthood. Then in 597 BC, along with 10,000 other Jews, he was carried into captivity into Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. 5 years after being carried into captivity, God called Ezekiel to be his prophet, to be his mouthpiece. The Israelites were not following God at this time, as so often they were. They were sinning and doing their own thing. Back in Jerusalem, the walls around the city were destroyed in parts. And the remnant of the Jews that had been left behind after the captivity, they were vulnerable. No one had stepped up to renovate the wall around Jerusalem. And God speaks through Ezekiel in Ezekiel 22:30. I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so I would not have to destroy it, but I found no one. Some 150 years later, Nehemiah, who was living in exile in Babylon, was called by God to do something about the walls of Jerusalem. So let's read Nehemiah 1. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned, and I fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Nehemiah then goes on in the rest of chapter 1 to pray a prayer of confession and request for wisdom. He acknowledges sin on behalf of the nation of Israel. At this time, Nehemiah is cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. So let's continue in chapter 2 and see what it says. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. I've lost my place, sorry. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven. And I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so I can rebuild it. Then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me with safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have letters to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. Now, I'm no expert at building, as I've already said, but I've mentioned that those around me do know how to build, and I've been around those people. I also love to watch the DIY shows like Chip and Joanna Gaines' Fixer Upper. I'm sure some of you also enjoy that. So I picked up on a few things, and today I want to talk to you about gaps and spaces. Big gaps need filling, need to be filled. There you go, like that one. God was calling out through the prophet Ezekiel for someone to stand in the gap, to lead the big job of restoring the wall around Jerusalem. But no one had answered the call, and the people who were left behind there in Jerusalem were vulnerable to being attacked from other tribes that surrounded them. It wasn't until 150 years later, working as a cupbearer to the king, that Nehemiah hears a report which absolutely breaks his heart. Now, we don't have Nehemiah's heritage, his lineage, which is actually unusual. We'd normally be told this. So all we know is that his father is Hakaliah. But Nehemiah wrote this book himself as an account of what happened. And it shows as part of his character that we are not told or didn't state his lineage. All we know is that he is a layman who worked in a privileged position as a cupbearer to the king. He was a humble layman who was moved by the serious situation back in Jerusalem, and he put up his hand to do something about that big job. Big gaps require answers, and the first thing that Nehemiah did was to pray. Chapter 1, verse 4, it said, When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before God of heaven. And then in chapter 2, when the king asks, What is wrong? Before he answers, he prays. The king said to me, What is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven. This little guy's name is Douglas, and the walls of his short life came crashing down a few months ago. On February the 26th, in the middle of the cold Papua New Guinea night, a seismic event happened 30 kilometres below the surface, releasing a monstrous earthquake that would rock the interior of the southern part of the island of New Guinea, killing 145 people and impacting almost 500,000 in 4 provinces, pushing 270,000 people out of their homes, destroying their houses, their gardens, their water, their schools, their villages, and laying waste to communities. The earthquake was a massive 7.5 magnitude. It impacted the Hela, the Southern Highlands, the Western Province, and significantly, and the Sandown Province to some extent, with more than 200 aftershocks that followed for the month after. As land caved in along the fault line that runs from the Papuan Highlands in the north to the Fly River lowlands in the south, whole villages were abandoned. Villages that had 200 people swelled to 2,000 overnight as survivors banded together, with no gardens, no water, and unable to account for so many others of their friends and relatives. Villages could only wait for help to come and reach them. World Hope International was one of the first agencies into this devastated area, and our volunteer Sally was in the village where Douglas was staying when another 6.7 magnitude earthquake struck in the dead of night, and that was just 2 of 4 significant ones of that magnitude that struck during that 2-month period. Douglas and his family ran out of the shelter that they had been staying in, and as he ran, he tripped and split his head open quite badly. The family ran to the airstrip, which they had actually been told to do, the airstrip, big, significantly open area and safe. So the communities were told, if this continues to happen, that's where they're to go. And the family did that. They ran there, and they found Sally was there, and she administered first aid in the dark. In fact, she told me that she feared for her life that night. She thought she'd only just arrived 2 days earlier, and she said she thought she was going to die that night. This village doesn't have an aid post because a couple of years ago the government closed 40% of all rural aid posts due mainly to the lack of staff. With a population of 7 million people in Papua New Guinea and approximately 400 doctors, of which 51 of them work outside of the capital city of Port Moresby. despite the fact that 87% of the population lives in the rural areas. To put that into perspective, that's one doctor for every 18,000 people compared to one for every 300 here in Australia. The walls of healthcare in Papua New Guinea are broken, and communities in rural areas are vulnerable, and even more so since the earthquake. There is a big gap that needs filling, and World Hope International is working with partners in Papua New Guinea, local grassroots partners in Papua New Guinea, to provide healthcare to rural communities such as the one where Douglas lives. Our volunteer, just as a follow-up, our volunteer was able to medevac Douglas and his mum to a nearby town where there was a hospital, and he's doing well. He's actually back home, and the photo with him in the blue is him back home again, and he's doing well. Nor and her husband, Shrin, have 3 beautiful children. They're farmers growing rice and cassava in a small field in rural Cambodia. Shrin sometimes had to go to a far town in the north to work as a woodcutter. When food wasn't available, the family would find snails and crabs to eat from the rice field to feed their family. Without any stable income, the children weren't able to attend school, and when they fell ill, there was no money to pay for medical treatment. World Hope helped Noor and her family to learn about growing mushrooms in a mushroom house, an intensive mushroom house, and their life has changed. Now they no longer need to borrow money at a higher interest rate. They can afford to purchase seedlings for growing other crops, and they have electricity in their home, and their children can go back to school. Noor and her family plan to extend the mushroom house so that they can reach their goal of purchasing a truck, a motorbike, drill a well, and build a toilet. In Cambodia, World Hope International has empowered 85 rural families to build 120 mushroom houses, which processes about 500 kilograms of mushrooms a night. Just take a look at this video, which will tell you a bit more in detail about what our program there is. Broken walls in Jerusalem needed someone to stand up and lead, someone who would put up the hand and say, let's get this job done. Nehemiah answered that call. In Cambodia, World Hope International saw a need for rural families to be empowered with economic investment. In PNG, World Hope International is answering the call to provide healthcare to rural villages. World Hope International is answering that call to stand up and to help rebuild broken walls and to fill the gap for vulnerable communities around the globe in 15 countries. So as I've watched these DIY shows, I've seen how they do a few things like laying tiles. I know that to keep tiles straight and in line, there needs to be gap keepers. So once you have a straight beginning point and you lay your first row of tiles, you then need to use gap keepers so that there's an even, neat space between each tile. Nehemiah didn't just run off and wing it, hoping that things would fall into place. After he heard the news, which saddened him, he stopped and he prayed. And then he began to make a strategic plan. When the opportunity came, Nehemiah asked permission from the king to take leave and go and lead the big restoration project, and to also give him letters so that he could travel safely. He also asks for letters of permission to access the resources that he was going to need to rebuild the wall. He went with the support of the king of Babylon. There were those in Jerusalem who did oppose Nehemiah's rebuilding efforts, but he had the support of the people in general, as we see in chapter 2, verse 17 and 18. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of God on me and what the king had said. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. They wanted to get the job done. They were embarrassed about the state of their city, and they were vulnerable to attack. So they were encouraged with this leadership to step up and to work. Later in the book of Nehemiah, we read about how he organised the people in Jerusalem into work groups. And he had them fixing the wall that was closest to their dwelling or workplace, guaranteeing that it would be that the wall would be well built if it was protecting their own home. Dr. Joanne Lyon, who is the former CEO and founder of World Hope International, she's actually going to be here in a couple of months' time. She shares this story. In 1996, my life was dramatically changed after reading a New York Times article titled "Children for Sale," which exposed the massive sex trafficking operation in Svay, Cambodia. I felt God tugging at my heart to see the area for myself, she says. And soon after the article's publication, a missionary friend invited me along to tag along on his trip to the area. In July, I arrived in Svay and came face to face with the trafficking industry. Within hours of landing, I stumbled upon a horrific scene in the middle of the street as we made our way to the hotel. Children sitting on plastic chairs lining the street and waiting to be sold. The road looked as if it would never end. My head was spinning. Where to start? Who to contact? What to do? How can this be? Our team joined hands on the corner of the street right there and prayed a simple but powerful prayer. Lord, we don't know what to do or what you're calling us to do, but we're here. Use us. On returning back to the US, Joanne established World Hope International as a Christian relief organisation and the official development arm of the Wesleyan Methodist Church Wesleyan Church, as a way to put an end to trafficking. World Hope International went on to establish a shelter home for underage girls who had been rescued from trafficking, and over the next 13 years worked alongside other faith agencies in Cambodia to bring about real and sustaining change. In 2007, one of Svaypak's vilest brothels was converted into a church and a community centre, offering education, medical care, children's ministries, and more to the formerly ravaged community. Joanne could have rushed right in and started rescuing these girls, but instead she and the group that she was with stopped right there and prayed for wisdom. They asked God to show them what to do and made them available to his direction. World Hope International provided a structured and organised way to combat human trafficking and care for rescued girls. In the same way, now, with the health crisis in Papua New Guinea, I'm not going to rush off and start trying to provide healthcare. I'm not medically trained. World Hope International supports grassroots partners who have the knowledge and the experience. God calls us to stand in the gap, and he provides gap keepers to give guidance and structure and vision. And he calls us as individuals to be on board. I spoke earlier about filling the spaces between the nail and the floorboard with putty so that people's feet don't get hurt on a nail sticking out. And the putty can also be used to spread between the floorboards so that the dust and air don't come up. There are other fillers like expander foam, which is used for filling awkward gaps and cracks and cavities, and has many other uses from insulation to adhesion to waterproofing. And there is grout and silicone for filling the gap between tiles, and finally gap filler, which is used for finishing off cornices. Again on tiles, according to Brendan, once the tiles are laid, they are nice and they're nice and even, with space keepers to keep them all in line. The gaps are filled with grout to ensure that they stay in place. The grout hardens when it dries out, so every 3 metres you actually have to fill that space with silicone, which is a flexible consistency, and this allows for movement and stops the tiles from breaking if they do move. God opened Nehemiah's eyes to the situation back in Jerusalem, and he called him to lead the restoration. Nehemiah, despite being a layman, was also in a position of accessing resources for the job. Then when he had arrived in Jerusalem and surveyed the situation, Nehemiah then called the people to get on board and do their bit according to their ability. Some were to guard those who were working because there was the opposition, and some were to actually do the rebuilding of the wall. Everyone needed to do their task for the wall to be built. And to ensure that the job was done well, as we said, he had them working at the wall closest to their home or business. With everyone working according to their ability, the walls were built and the community was strengthened. In international aid and development, it takes all levels of effort to fill the gap. There is the in-country grassroots partner organisation leading the effort to fight the injustice, the local churches, the pastors, the healthcare workers, the frontline people carrying out the work. Then there's the organisation back here in Australia, raising awareness of the issues of injustice and other needs. And then there's the donor, or the prayer, or those that go on short-term teams. When God answered Joanne Lyon's prayer, he led her to set up an organisation and lead it. He didn't send her to Cambodia. Joanne used her talents as a leader and a speaker to raise awareness and money so that others who did have the gifts and abilities to minister on the front line in Cambodia were able to rescue thousands of girls. God is not calling all of us to go overseas to minister. He's not calling all of us to set up an organisation or to lead one. He is, however, calling all of us to do something about the poor, the vulnerable, the widow and the orphan. He's calling us to do something about the gap. James 1:27, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. James 2:14-16, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? Will you join World Hope in doing something about the gap? One of those ways that you can be on board is to become an ambassador for World Hope and represent us in your local church, to share updates and information about our ministry, to raise awareness of our work and to fundraise for the projects, as well as organise teams to go on short team trips. Another way to fill the gap is to donate monthly so that World Hope can support medical students who are studying in Papua New Guinea so that they can go back to their rural communities and provide the health care where there currently is none. Or you could give regularly to one of our projects, such as the Mushroom House in Cambodia, which provides income generation to rural Cambodians. We need prayers who will pray for our ministry and leaders. This is an essential part of filling the gap. And every single person in this room today can do that. Anna shared in the announcements the power of prayer for funding for SU. And I believe in that power of prayer, and I can't do my job without the power of prayer from believers around the world. On your chair, you would have received a card with a space keeper, a gap keeper. I'd encourage you to take that with you today. Stick it on your fridge, put it in your Bible, stick it on the dashboard of your car, and whenever you look at it, pray for the ministry of World Hope, but also pray what God is asking you to do to fill in the gaps. Dinner and discussion evenings is something that we've just begun, and that's where a host will invite their friends and family over to dinner. And one of our World Hope ambassadors will come along and share stories and information about World Hope. You could be a host and help to spread the word about our ministry, something very simple. We have internships in Cambodia, which we're actually really desperate to find. A sexual and gender-based violence program services volunteer and a social ventures business volunteer. I've got more information about those down the back, and come see me if you're interested to know more. And finally, you could sponsor a child through our Enable the Children program. In Sierra Leone, children with disabilities are in desperate need of care. Many times they're shunned by their families and their mothers are blamed for their disability. World Hope International's program provides support and care for families and provides physical therapy for the child and resources so that the children can have a better quality of life. We need sponsors who will sponsor a monthly amount of $49. And again, check out our table down the back. If you want to do that, come and see me. I have cards of children. We just need you to fill out the top bit and hand that bit to me, and then we'll contact you with further details. One big gap that we do have in Papua New Guinea right now, I was tossing up whether or not to say it, but I will. We need a vaccine refrigerator, and it's going to cost us $5,000. If you can fundraise for that, if you can, do a fun run or something like that, or bake sale or anything at all, we need $5,000 to provide a vaccine fridge for one of our very rural areas. So that the kids can get immunisation. That's one way that you can help. Will you answer the call to fill the gap as an ambassador, a dinner and discussion host, a prayer, a regular donor, or a once-off donor, or an intern? What is God calling you to do? If none of those things, definitely a prayer. I encourage you, as you leave today, to come and see me down the back, and I can share a bit more about World Hope and how you can be involved. Let's finish and pray. Father God, I thank you for the call that you do put out, and I thank you for those who have been able to stand up and say, I will fill the gap. And I pray for each one here today, Lord, that you are speaking to, that they will have the courage to step out and fill the gap that you're calling them to fill. Thank you, Lord, in your name.